Marianne Williamson, welcome to Primo Nutmeg.
Thank you for having me here.
Yeah, thank you very much for being on the show. I really do appreciate it, meeting you here in New Hampshire. How is the campaigning going this weekend?
It's going great. It feels like a privilege to have the opportunity to talk to people, particularly in these early primary states. People are just beginning to focus. There's 100 days left, a little more than 100 days. You can feel that people are thinking very deeply, as they should be. There are a lot of candidates, and there's a lot to think about, and it's an honor to be part of their process.
So in a few weeks, there is going to be another Democratic debate. As I understand it, you have not qualified for that debate. It's a similar situation where you need a certain number of donors as well as meeting criteria for DNC-approved polls. And you had not qualified for the last couple debates. I'm just wondering your overall thoughts on this DNC qualification process.
Well, look, I'm sort of radically American. I believe the voters should have the opportunity to decide. And I think the only thing that should narrow down the process is elections. I don't think we needed any of this. We didn't need narrowing down the number. That's the role of the voters. They could have 2 nights of debates. Voters are not children. People say, well, it's like children. You can't give them too many choices. And I thought that was such an example of the paternalism, because actually voters are not children. It's about money. The DNC is a private corporation, you know. They're not a government official thing. So in a way, the debate stage is like a reality TV show, quite literally. And it's them in cahoots, you know, the DNC sort of in partnership with the mainstream media and all that entails. I wish that I was on the debate stage, because that's where people are watching. That's where the eyeballs are. So obviously I'm disappointed that I'm not on there. But that's not what determines whether or not you're running for president. As long as people are sending in donations, as long as people are attending your events, and as long as your heart says to be out there. At least that's my criteria. So I'm out there. I'm running for president. And I wish my friends well, who are going to be on the next debate stage. I wish I was going to be with them. I think a lot of people feel it might be more interesting if I was there. But once again, it's not what determines whether or not somebody's running for president.
I do wonder how impactful the debates are, though, because I think that you made a really big impression at the second debate. And, you know, I think other candidates, you know, have had their moments, but I don't know if that really shifts the polling that much. Again, that calls into question how accurate the polls are as well. And, you know, all this obsession over polling is also very interesting, too, because this is all happening before any voter casts a vote.
Absolutely. That's why it's an artificial. I feel that the role of all political parties and their associated organizations should be to facilitate the process of democracy, not in any way to dictate the process of democracy. What happened for me was that after I did make quite a big splash after the second debate, there were clearly those who did not wish to see me continue. Quite a false narrative was created about me, my work, my past, my personality, wacko crystal lady, all that stuff. And it definitely, you know, took a hit. I've heard rather outrageous things said about me in terms of what my work is, that no one could believe who actually knows my work, has read my books, or attended my lectures. So I have not been able to override that, except when I'm actually with voters. When I'm actually talking to people, it's clear that that narrative is not who I am. And that's why I hope that I will be able to raise the money to get TV ads. You know, it's a process. It's a big, journey. But I'm glad to be in this journey, and I'm in it to win it.
Well, you do have a unique and somewhat unconventional message and approach, and I think maybe, you know, that gives the media some cover to go after you, especially how you were kind of satirized on Saturday Night Live, for example. When you're speaking with voters and you're speaking about, you know, the politics of love and about spirituality in the context of politics, are they generally receptive, or are you getting any sort of negative feedback about that message?
I'm getting extraordinarily positive feedback, because I'm talking about the fact that something has gone very wrong in this country, and everybody knows that. I'm talking about the fact that for the last 40 years we've been sliding away from a vital democracy into a corporate aristocracy, that a kind of authoritarian corporatism has not only corrupted capitalism as we know it, it has corrupted our government, it has hijacked America's moral value system. The fact that it has left 93 million people near poverty, that it has created a situation where millions and millions of people live in chronic economic tension and anxiety, tens of millions of people who don't know what they'll do if they get sick or if one of their children gets sick. Tens of millions of people don't know how they will send their children to college or what they will do to get under the burden of these college loans. The fact that we have 13 million hungry children in the United States, 100,000 homeless children in the United States, millions of American children who are diagnosed with PTSD just living where they live. The fact that if we don't take radical action in the next 12 years to reverse climate change, that we could have a level of massive social collapse within 20 years unseen within the modern era. When people hear about our national security agenda being dominated so much by short-term profit maximization for defense contractors to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars over and above what the military says they need, when people hear a serious conversation about dealing with the racial tension in this country and taking reparative measures and genuine reconciliation between whites and blacks in America and between whites and Native Americans. No, the American people are good. The American people are decent. Yes, you better believe the American people hear me. And in my experience, I feel heard. I feel that people are ready for the engagement. You know, the problem is not the American people. That's my experience. My experience in all of this is that the system is even more corrupt than I feared, but the people are even more wonderful than I knew. We're great. That's not the problem. The basic decency of the American people is solid. The problem is that our government, there is a divergence there between the goodness and the decency of the American people and the way our government behaves. Because in a representative democracy, our government should be representing the will or the consciousness of the people. And we all know that's not what's happening. We know that our government does more to represent the will of huge multinational corporate entities who are seeking nothing except to improve their short-term profits. This is a breach. This is a breach not only between the people and our government. This is a breach between our government and democracy itself. So do I feel that the American people hear that? When I speak at events, I absolutely do. And I feel this is a pregnant moment in American democracy where, with the right leadership, Americans are ready to transform all that, to make a fundamental break with the past, to end an aberrational chapter in our history, to begin a new one, and to make a break with the patterns, the economic patterns, the social patterns, and the political patterns that have come to define our country today.
So if government is beholden to this corporate aristocracy and doing their bidding and really causing negative effects for all of us Americans who you're saying typically have it together, shouldn't the argument be then that we really should be reducing the power of government and restricting it so that people can kind of get along and cooperate more voluntarily without government?
Well, that's the argument if you're a right-wing Republican who's really just trying to leave people out to dry. No, that's not the argument of a conscious conservative or a conscious liberal. That's neither a high-minded liberal nor a high-minded conservative value. The idea is that government is here to be of the people, by the people, and for the people. All government policy, in my opinion, should be based on the idea that it should help make people thrive. That's what all public policy should be. It should be answering the question, what helps people thrive? You can't say to a small child to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. The government should get out of the way and let the kid pull themselves up by their bootstraps. Those children don't even have boots. You're talking about millions of Americans who do all the right thing. They work hard. They work sometimes 2 and 3 jobs just to make ends meet. Meanwhile, the government is certainly not getting out of the way of helping the richest Americans. They're doing their bidding. No, the answer for the person who's working so hard in the richest country in the world, who has to work 2 or 3 jobs just to make ends meet, and then they come home at night and they don't have the energy or the bandwidth to be present for their spouse or read their child a bedtime story. No, the answer is not for government to get out of the way. The answer is for government to get busy and take back that massive transfer of wealth that went to 1% of our population and do what it takes to create economic opportunity for those people, 90% of those people who are working so hard and are being so shafted by their own government.
It seems like you're talking about sort of, in the spiritual renewal of America, that needs to be really a broad movement that touches many different parts of people's lives. And I think that obviously the labor movement is something that needs to come back and be part of people's lives again, and helping fight against this corporate aristocracy. Again, I just kind of wonder, when we're talking about the state and we're talking about what government is, and the fact that it is coercion, and it's do this or.
What do you mean it is coercion?
Well,
not every action of the state is coercion.
Well, if you don't do what the state dictates, then you're punished in some way, right?
Well,
You're taxed, or you're.
there are laws. There are traffic laws. I assume you parked your car somewhere when you came here.
Sure.
I wouldn't call the traffic law, the parking law, the parking signs, the traffic signs. I wouldn't call that coercion. That's appropriate rules so that we can all live together.
Sure, but if you don't pay your parking ticket, then you can be arrested and put in a cage.
I think that's a rather blunt, and even, if I may say, it's a little bit of a crude description. We have traffic laws so that everybody can be safe. And yes, if somebody runs a red light, then they should be held accountable for that, because it's dangerous for them to be on the road thinking they can just cross red lights anytime they want to.
When we talk about, there are other kind of institutions that are important in American life, again, like the church, the family, labor organizations. How do you kind of define what the contours of government are?
Well, I think that there is a healthy skepticism. Nobody wants overreach by the government. But the issue is we also don't want overreach by corporate America. And so there is a balance here. I think that whether you're on the left or the right, you should have, and people do have, an appropriate skepticism about overreach by government. But when it comes to helping people, we're living in an era of underreach by government. We're living in an era when government basically is just leaving people on their own. And I believe that the appropriate function of government is what it says in the Declaration of Independence, that God gave inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness to all men, and that governments are instituted to secure those rights. If a child goes to elementary school, and as millions do in America, and do not even have the adequate school supplies with which to teach a child to read, then that means if a child cannot learn to read by 8, then the chances of high school graduation are drastically decreased, and the chances of incarceration are drastically increased. So I believe, yes, that it is government's role. If the government is here to secure the right to pursue happiness, that child has no right to pursue happiness that is not getting a decent education and a chance to learn to read by the age of 8, given that we are the richest country in the world. So yes, that to me is an example of government's proper role.
So one question that I wish was talked about more in the debates is press freedom, and specifically Julian Assange. These whistleblowers for Ukraine have really been in the news lately. And it brings to mind other whistleblowers like Julian Assange, like Edward Snowden, like Chelsea Manning, like Bill Binney. I mean, the list goes on and on. But specifically Julian Assange, who is now in prison, fighting extradition. I'm just wondering what your overall thoughts on him, his work, and if he should be prosecuted.
We're either going to protect the whistleblowers or not. We're not going to protect the whistleblower. And I've been concerned about the more recent reports about his state, the state of his health. I find it very concerning. We have to protect the whistleblowers.
In regards to WikiLeaks and just the information that they put out, both in regards to the Iraq War, which is what he's being prosecuted on, and then also more recently in regards to the 2016 election and exposing the sort of corruption within the DNC or cooperation with media companies and whatnot. Do you have just any thoughts on if they've made valuable contributions, or do you think that they've gone too far?
Daniel Ellsberg, this was my generation. Daniel Ellsberg in the Pentagon Papers, the whistleblower, and I think we're seeing it right now with the Ukraine situation and the president. The whistleblower is vital in our society. And even the things that you mentioned, what was exposed was malfeasance. So, to one person is whistleblowing that should be protected. To another person is espionage. So that's that has to be looked at very carefully. But as you yourself said, the things that were exposed there tended to be illegal acts.
So I did also want to, since we're talking about this, also bring up RussiaGate, which has really been in the news, for the past 3 years. And I read a quote online of you saying that the Russians' hack into the 2016 election was analogous to Pearl Harbor. Do you believe?
Did I say that?
I saw on the Council on Foreign Relations website. I don't know if you actually did say that or write that, but that's what is up there
Well,
attributed to.
if that, yeah. Okay, so.
Is that, would that be an accurate reflection of how you assess the
Yeah, I
situation?
mean, 17 intelligence agencies in the United States all agreed that Russia did seek to interfere with our elections. And that would be analogous to an attack on Pearl Harbor. If you attack our elections, you're attacking it's like a major organ in the body politic. I mean, what is our freedom? What is our liberty? What is our democracy without our elections? So yeah, that's a big deal.
Okay. I just want to correct you. I know initially the 17 agencies thing that was put out. That was actually retracted by New York Times. I think that there has been a lot of kind of conflicting reports, and things have been characterized differently. When we look at the RussiaGate saga, what do you think are the most damning pieces of evidence that there was collusion or that Russia did hack and influence the vote?
Well, cybersecurity experts and Facebook itself have concluded that many of the ads that were posted, many of the stories that were told were false, were outright false, and were there for the express purpose of helping to elect one candidate and to defeat another. I mean, what more do you need? That's kind of it right there.
I think that there were different ads for different points of view, though, right? Like some were supporting Bernie Sanders, for example. There's a really famous one of like a silly coloring book of Bernie Sanders in a Speedo. And there's other ads for Black Lives Matter. So the argument was that they were sowing discord, just across the political spectrum. But even that, there was a famous instance in the Robert Mueller hearings where he was sort of asked about how he was unable to prove in court that the Internet Research Agency, who was putting out all this clickbait, that they weren't able to actually prove that they were tied to the Russian government.
Your report famously links Russian internet troll farms with the Russian government. Yet at a hearing on May 28th in the Concord Management IRA prosecution that you initiated, the judge excoriated both you and Mr. Barr for producing no evidence to support this claim. Why did you suggest Russia was responsible for the troll farms when in court you've been unable to produce any evidence to support it?
Well, I'm not going to get into that any further than I already have.
But you have left the clear impression throughout the country through your report that it was the Russian government behind the troll farms, and yet when you're called upon to provide actual evidence in court, you fail to do so.
Well, I would again dispute your characterization of what occurred in that proceeding.
In fact, the judge, considered holding prosecutors in criminal contempt. She backed off only after your hastily called press conference the next day in which you retroactively made the distinction between the Russian government and the Russia troll farms. Did your press conference of May 29th have anything to do with the threat to hold your prosecutors in contempt the previous day for publicly misrepresenting the evidence?
What was the question?
I look at the whole saga and just the kind of claims and then being pushed back, and then
There are people on both the right and the left who have doubts about RussiaGate. This is what I know. There are assaults on our democracy. That I do know. We can argue about where those particular assaults come from and what those particular assaults are. But the point is, there are assaults on our democracy. And what is needed is a reawakening of the democratic spirit among the American people. What we need is to make sure, regardless whether Russia is active or not, regardless of what's happening inside the government or not, what is most important is that the American people vote in this next election. Because nothing, whether it's Russia, whether it's domestic, whether it's foreign, there is no threat to our democracy that can stand if enough people vote. And in order for enough people to vote, we have to have some radical truth-telling so that enough people feel that there's really a legitimate reason for them to vote, that there's really a way in which their vote will make a difference. And that's what I'm concentrating on. I'm not so much concentrating on the opportunistic infection, I'm concentrating on the immune system of American democracy, and that is the American citizen. And that's what we all need to be concentrating on ourselves right now. Not so much what Russia did or didn't do, or anybody else did or didn't do, given that there are areas where none of us know totally for sure. We need to ask what we ourselves are doing or not doing, what we are going to do or not going to do in order to put this country back on track.
I think what's most concerning about it for me is, I look at the kind of pushback against independent media that's been used under the guise of protecting democracy.
Yes.
And also, I mean, that's, exemplified by Julian Assange, because even though he's being charged on things from 2010, I think that the controversy over 2016 is giving cover to that. And I think that, it's really feeding into also that we're seeing, I believe, in Tulsi Gabbard's words, a renewal of the Cold War. And, when I think about the politics of love and what that would mean on an international scale, it seems as though we do need détente, right? We do need our leaders talking to each other, even if you have authoritarian regimes or despotic regimes. We need to kind of all talk to each other so that we don't blow up the planet.
Well, I think neither Democrats nor Republicans are arguing that we shouldn't be talking to each other. That would certainly be true whether you're talking about Obama or Trump. Of course, they're talking to the Chinese leaders. Of course, they're talking to the Russian leaders. But that's true in life. I might not agree with you, but we still got to keep talking, because how else are you going to work it out unless you're talking?
Sure, but we don't have nuclear weapons pointed at each other.
All the more reason why we should be talking.
Exactly. So, I mean, that I think is, when I look at the corporate media and I look at the hysteria, Rachel Maddow every night talking about Russia hysteria, and you turn on Fox News and they're talking about China and how we need to stand up to them. It just seems as though the political spectrum in the U.S., it's just fueling this sort of international conflict, and you don't just see it with those countries, you see it with Iran, you see it with Venezuela, you see it with Syria.
Well, these situations are not simple. I mean, there's some nice people out there, and there's some people out there who are not so nice. So it's not like the media should report that everything's wonderful in a walk through an English garden and it's all very sweet and wonderful, when in fact it's not either. I hear what you're saying, that there are cases, and I would agree with you, where the media is sowing the conflict by reporting a conflict in order to really keep up their own monetary advantage and so forth. But there are also situations where it is equally true that the press has a responsibility to explain to us, even when situations are complicated and somewhat gnarly, what's really happening in the world. The role of journalism is not just to tell us the good news, but to tell us the truth, and that has to do both with international situations as well as domestic. I think where you and I would agree is how often these days it's hard to know exactly what the news is that you're getting. And I think that that's all the more reason so many of us need to be reading and thinking for ourselves. And you're right, not just the corporate media, but the independent as well.
So last question I want to ask you. I know there's been a lot of controversy the last couple of weeks with Hillary Clinton asserting that Tulsi Gabbard may be encouraged by the Russians to run as a third-party candidate, even though she's repeatedly said she's not going to run as a third-party candidate, and Hillary Clinton also called Jill Stein a Russian asset. I'm just wondering, if you were unable to win the Democratic nomination, would you consider running with the Green Party or independent?
No, not this year. I believe that Donald Trump and his administration and his agenda are a threat to our democracy, and I wouldn't do anything, not one thing, to take even 10 votes away from the Democrat this year. I hope I'm the nominee, but if I'm not, I'm signed up to help whoever is.
Awesome. Well, Marianne Williamson, I really do appreciate you being on this episode of Primo Nutmeg. For folks out there who would like to follow you and get involved in your campaign, how can they do that?
Thank you. Marianne2020.com. And I hope people will, that they'll get on the mailing list and donate and volunteer and do all those things that will help this campaign become all that it can be.
Awesome. Well, thank you again. Appreciate your time.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.